The wealthy in-laws invited the poor mother of the groom to the wedding, but gave her the address of the wrong restaurant. But then they saw an imposing cortege of black SUVs pull up and watched as she stepped out. The Miller family rose from humble beginnings, building their success brick by brick. In their early days, they were like any ordinary American family. Susan Miller worked at a local daycare, while her husband, Edward Miller, was an engineer. What set them apart wasn't their professions but their towering ambitions and barely concealed disdain for ordinary folks. They dismissed nearly everything around them as subpar. "This whole town feels like a thrift shop that only sells junk," Susan would often say, crinkling her nose as she walked past the neighborhood stores. She had a fondness for shopping at high-end consignment boutiques that imported designer items from Europe and the US. "Why do people waste money on these overpriced chains? My mother always said, there's a sucker born every minute, and honestly, she wasn't wrong," she liked to add with a knowing smirk. Susan considered herself above the mundane world of local bargains and sales racks. Her aspirations reached far beyond the small-town life she despised. She often bragged to her friends about her ability to find gems in consignment stores, like the time she scored a vintage Chanel coat for just a few $100s. To her, it wasn't merely a coat, it was a symbol of sophistication, a way to distinguish herself from the mediocre masses. "You know," she'd say while swirling a glass of red wine at her monthly ladies' night, "I can't fathom why people spend their hard-earned money to look just like everyone else. No individuality, no style. It's like they're sheep in a pasture all bleating the same tune." Her friends would nod, though some secretly resented Susan's patronizing tone. None dared to challenge her. Susan had positioned herself as the group's self-proclaimed authority on style and culture. "Sandra, tell me honestly, do I dress like a frump?" one of Susan's friends, Rachel, asked during one of these gatherings. "Why would you even ask that?" Sandra replied, feigning indifference. "It's Susan. She's always making comments about people's outfits," Rachel admitted. "Every time I'm around her, I second-guess my wardrobe choices. I'm terrified she'll notice something off and call me out on it." "Come on, Rachel, you're overthinking this," Sandra said. "Susan's opinions aren't the gospel. Wear what makes you happy." But Susan's critical eye didn't just weigh heavily on her friends. Its shadow loomed large within the Miller household, too. Their home wasn't filled with warmth or laughter, but rather with a relentless drive for achievement. Every morning followed the same rigorous routine. Susan would rise early to prepare a meticulously balanced breakfast. "A proper breakfast is the foundation of success," she would say, as she handed plates of steel-cut oats and fruit to her kids. Their schedules were strict, with no room for deviation. Piano lessons, chess club, and advanced tutoring sessions packed their after-school hours, leaving little time for play. While Susan grudgingly went to her daycare job, she saw it as a temporary stepping stone, a means to an end. She took special interest in children from influential families, seeing them as potential keys to her ambitions. "Ella, sweetheart, would you like an extra cookie with your milk?" Susan asked with a saccharine smile. "I want a cupcake," Ella demanded, her voice shrill. "I'm sorry, darling, we don't have cupcakes today," Susan replied apologetically. "But I want one!" Ella stomped her tiny foot. Susan sighed, grabbing her purse and heading to the nearby bakery during her break. She returned with an assortment of cupcakes, her frustration masked by a polished smile. It wasn't about the cupcakes. It was about keeping the Pattersons happy. After all, in Susan's eyes, pleasing the right people was far more important than her actual job. Everything changed one day during a Children's Day recital. Parents had gathered in the school auditorium to watch their children perform. As the kids stood on stage, excited and ready to showcase their talents, Ella decided to seize the spotlight by throwing a tantrum over her costume. "I don't like this! I want a princess costume!" she wailed loudly, her arms crossed and her face scrunched in anger. All eyes turned to Susan, who instinctively rushed to assist her favourite. The other children on stage froze, bewildered and upset, as their performance ground to a halt. Susan ignored them entirely, focusing all her attention on Ella, as though the rest of the children didn't exist. Parents began whispering to one another, frustration growing among the crowd at the blatant favoritism. Finally, one mother stepped onto the stage and spoke up. "Let's give all the children a chance to shine," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Why should one child's whims ruin it for everyone else?" The suggestion was met with a wave of applause and cheers from the audience. Susan's face flushed as she realized her carefully cultivated image of authority and control was unraveling before her eyes. She tried to interject, but her voice was drowned out by the parents' collective approval. In that moment, Susan understood she had lost the trust of the parents. Her meticulously laid plans to curry favor and manipulate her position were crumbling. She would have to rethink her approach, or risk losing her job altogether. While Susan was busy catering to the whims of the influential, her husband, Edward Miller, remained engrossed in his work designing and developing new technical devices for the factory. Unlike Susan, Edward divided his attention equally between his passion for mechanics and his ability to navigate the complex dynamics of office politics. Edward spent countless hours in his home office, surrounded by blueprints and diagrams, immersed in calculations and experiments. His work at the factory allowed him to bring his ideas to life, and he took pride in every new machine that rolled off the production lines under his guidance. Yet, at home, Edward had to downplay even his smallest victories to avoid upsetting Susan. His responses to her were carefully measured. "Yes, Susan." "Of course, Susan." Or, "You're right, Susan." These phrases became his default replies to fit nearly every situation. Only at work could Edward truly breathe, escaping for a while from the overbearing control of his wife. The factory where Edward worked manufactured machines for a variety of industries. His team of engineers was constantly improving existing designs and developing new solutions to enhance efficiency and cut costs. Every day brought fresh challenges, but Edward welcomed them, viewing each obstacle as an opportunity to prove himself and contribute to the factory's growth. One morning, Edward was at his desk, engrossed in the details of a new project, when the factory director, Thomas Archer, walked in. The director's face was serious, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes. "Edward," he began, "we've just received an order to develop a new device for a major corporation. The requirements are strict, and the deadlines are nearly impossible. But if we pull this off, it could pave the way for us to break into the international market. I want you to lead the project." Edward Miller considered the proposal carefully. It was a daunting task, one that would require significant effort and ingenuity, but it was exactly the kind of challenge he thrived on. After a moment of thought, he nodded and replied, "Send me all the materials and details, and I'll get started immediately." Thomas smiled, handing him a thick folder of documents. "Thank you, Edward," he said, his voice carrying a note of sincerity. "I knew I could count on you." Opportunities like this came to Edward periodically, and each time they reignited a restless determination within him. He knew the road ahead would be filled with long nights, demanding days, and a cascade of complex problems. Yet, he believed in his skills and trusted his team to tackle any challenge. Few could have imagined back in those days that the Miller family would eventually become one of the most influential in the city. Even then, in their modest 3-bedroom apartment, they would gather to discuss plans, share dreams, and strategize their escape from the monotony of their lives. "We're not like the people around us. We're better than this," Susan Miller would remind her children regularly. "But for now, we have to live and work among this grey mass." Although she worked as a daycare teacher, Susan dreamed of bigger things. She devoured books on finance and psychology, trying to understand the principles of business and how to influence people effectively. She constantly sought ways to refine her strategies and prepare for the day she could rise above her circumstances. Edward, on the other hand, was less focused on manipulation and more on action. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with clarity and precision. One day, Edward declared to his wife, "Susan, I'm tired of working for someone else. It's time we start our own business." Susan turned to him, her piercing gaze locking onto his. It felt as though she could see straight through him. After a moment's pause, she said, "I've wanted to start a business for a long time, but I didn't think you'd support me. I've been preparing for this. I didn't read all those books on business psychology for nothing." Edward gave her a measured look and asked, "And what exactly do you want to do?" Taking a deep breath, Susan launched into her ideas, laying out her plans with enthusiasm and confidence. Edward listened intently, not interrupting her once. When she finished, he nodded and said, "All right, but you know success comes with sacrifices, don't you? Are you ready for that?" Susan met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, I'm ready. If I have to, I'll step over anyone who stands in our way. You know me? I don't hold back." The next day, they sprang into action. Their first venture was opening an office equipment store. They borrowed money from relatives and friends to raise the initial capital, but the couple never doubted their success. They rented a small office in the downtown area, hired a handful of employees, and advertised through local TV channels and newspapers. Edward used his connections and offered advice to help Susan navigate the early challenges. At first, business was slow, with only a few customers trickling in. But gradually, word spread, and the store began turning a profit. It became a popular spot among locals, known for its quality products and friendly service. Within a year, they opened a second store, and within a few years, they had built an entire chain. As their profits grew, so did their hunger for power and control. "Edward, if only you knew how exhausting it is to keep smiling at everyone," Susan sighed one evening. "Honestly, if someone isn't useful to me, why should I even bother pretending to care?" She added, "And let's be real, computers aren't like groceries. People don't buy them every month. We need a way to keep them coming back." Edward agreed with her assessment, but understood the importance of maintaining the appearance of a successful business that cared about its customers. They both knew that their success wasn't just about offering good products. It was about creating an experience of warmth and professionalism that clients appreciated. Still, with each new store they opened and every additional dollar they earned, their sense of superiority over their customers deepened. One evening, after a long day of work, Edward and Susan sat in their cozy home office, discussing their future plans. "Susan, just imagine how much we could achieve if we expanded our network across the entire country," Edward said, his eyes drifting toward the horizon of possibilities. "Yes, of course," Susan replied with a sly smile. "But is that enough? After all, we don't just want to be wealthy, do we?" Her words unsettled Edward. He knew exactly what she meant. Over the years, they had built their business together, masking their ambitions beneath the guise of hard work and perseverance. But now their deeper desires, long hidden, were beginning to surface. "What are you getting at?" he asked cautiously. "I'm saying that money is just a tool. Real power isn't about having money, it's about controlling the people who depend on it," Susan said, fixing him with a sharp, unwavering gaze. "Do you remember how we started?" she continued. "We bent over backward to please every single customer, desperate for approval. But now we're in a position to dictate the terms." A chill ran down Edward's spine. He had often entertained thoughts about wielding their influence differently, but hearing Susan put it so plainly made him realize she was ready to push further than ever before. "So, what do you suggest?" he asked quietly, feeling a long dormant ambition stir within him. "Let's start small. Let's make our stores exclusive, a place where people feel like they're part of something bigger. We'll create a membership system. Only select customers will get special privileges. It won't just boost profits, it'll secure our position among the local elite," Susan explained, her voice brimming with confidence. Edward's eyes lit up. The idea was audacious but practical. They could offer premium products, private sales, and exclusive perks to those willing to pay for the privilege. "It's brilliant," Edward said, a grin spreading across his face. From that moment on, they poured their efforts into implementing the idea. They used their skill in persuasion and manipulation to steer customers and partners into decisions that served their interests. Slowly but surely, their clientele and associates became mere pieces in their game of influence and success. Years passed, and their company grew to become one of the most successful in the region. Edward and Susan Miller were now esteemed business people, admired for their sharp instincts and determination. But behind the polished facade were two individuals willing to go to any lengths to achieve their goals. Their children, raised in an atmosphere of relentless calculation, learned to navigate life by their parents' ruthless rules. In this world, there's no room for weakness, Susan often reminded them. Either you're in control, or someone else is controlling you. Beyond their business empire, Susan expanded her reach into public life. She joined local civic organizations, became a fixture at charity galas, and quickly cultivated a reputation as a philanthropist and community leader. Before long, she was offered a position in local government. This new role allowed her to influence city budgets and steer lucrative contracts toward their chain of stores, solidifying their dominance. Meanwhile, Edward continued to expand and modernize their business, proving himself a master of networking and deal-making. "Don't worry, we'll take care of it," officials would often say with a knowing smile, quickly fulfilling his latest request. Over time, the Millers gained a reputation as more than just successful entrepreneurs. They became the unofficial power brokers of the city. Their influence seeped into every corner of civic life, from economics to politics. They knew exactly who to sway, who to place in key positions, and which projects to back to ensure things always went their way. Edward was a man who refused to rest on his laurels. His mind was constantly buzzing with ideas to expand and improve their empire. Whether it was adopting cutting-edge technologies or brokering lucrative contracts, he always had his sights set on the next big opportunity. One day, during an especially profitable period, Edward decided to invest in constructing a new factory. It was an ambitious and risky move, but his gut told him it was the right one. The factory would be the largest in the region, producing premium quality products and solidifying their market dominance. Edward began negotiations with city officials to secure the perfect location. Familiar with his business acumen, the authorities welcomed him warmly, eager to accommodate his plans. "Well, Mr. Miller, let's discuss the terms," one official said, a practiced smile on his face. "As always, your interests are our top priority." After months of meticulous planning and negotiation, construction began. The work was relentless. Teams of workers toiled day and night, driven by the promise of significant returns on the hefty investment. At the factory's grand opening ceremony, the city's most prominent figures gathered to celebrate. Standing proudly on the stage, Edward addressed the crowd, his chest puffed with pride. "My friends, today we inaugurate a new chapter for our community. This factory represents progress and prosperity, a symbol of our commitment to excellence. We will produce goods that set the standard not just locally, but internationally." Thunderous applause filled the air, reverberating through the crowd. Everyone understood that this factory marked the beginning of a new era for the region. Edward, however, knew the journey was far from over. There were more challenges ahead, but he relished them, convinced that success came from hard work and recognizing opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The Millers' first small business, launched years earlier, was now unrecognizable. They had become the epitome of the nouveau riche, driving luxury cars, residing in sprawling country estates, and enjoying every trapping of success. Life appeared serene and stable, as if all their dreams had finally come true. Yet, as their wealth and status grew, so did the emptiness within. Years of relentless work and calculated negotiations had hardened their hearts, leaving them numb to life's simple pleasures. The spark in their relationship dimmed as they drifted apart, consumed by their individual pursuits. Evenings once filled with shared ambitions and laughter were now spent in separate corners of their mansion. The Millers, who had built an empire together, found themselves isolated within it, their lives a testament to the cost of unyielding ambition. Olga found solace in extravagant shopping sprees and lavish vacations, while Edward buried himself in high-tech ventures, constantly seeking ways to innovate and expand their empire. To outsiders, their lives seemed like a dream, a successful businessman and his elegant globe-trotting wife. But behind this polished facade lay a far more complex truth. Some envied their wealth and status, saying, "You can't fault someone for living the good life." Others whispered behind their backs, "But are they really happy?" Only Edward and Susan knew the reality. They played their roles to perfection, maintaining an image of success, even as they felt a deep, unspoken longing for something more. No amount of luxury or glamour could conceal the emptiness that had crept into their lives. The gossip mills spun incessantly, and few were more enthusiastic contributors than the notorious busybodies, Angela and Rachel Dobson. Known for their inseparability and penchant for stirring up drama, they always had a new theory to share. "Have you heard the latest about our sweet power couple?" Angela chirped as she greeted her friend at their usual cafe. "You mean the Millers, right?" Rachel smirked like a cat that had just found the cream. "Of course! Who else?" Angela replied with mock surprise. "Come on, have you heard the news or not?" "No, what is it this time?" Rachel leaned in, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Did they go on another luxury cruise, or buy yet another sports car? Riveting! "No, nothing like that," Angela said, waving her hand, her bright manicure catching the light. "I saw Susan downtown recently and she looked off." "Off?" "Susan?" Rachel laughed dismissively. "She has everything. Money, travel, designer clothes. What could possibly be off about her?" "Exactly. That's what I thought," Angela said, lowering her voice. "But the more I looked at her, the more I realized something was missing. She seemed subdued." "What are you trying to say?" Rachel raised an eyebrow skeptically. "I don't know," Angela admitted. "Imagine having everything, wealth, power, prestige, but still feeling lonely or unfulfilled. Maybe she's missing something. Intangible." "Like what? A unicorn?" Rachel snorted. "Be serious," Angela said, rolling her eyes. "I mean, maybe she's craving real connection. Love. Understanding. You know, things money can't buy." "Oh, please," Rachel scoffed. "She has everything she could ever need. If she's bored, she can go find herself a younger, fitter version of Edward. These days, it's practically fashionable to have both a husband and a lover. No big deal." "Still, I've heard Edward spends most of his time buried in work, alone. Maybe things aren't as perfect as they seem," Angela said thoughtfully. "Angela, please. Millions of people live like that. You have to sacrifice something to get ahead. Nobody gets both eternal happiness and wild success." "You can't have your cake and eat it too," Rachel snapped, annoyed by her friend's sudden sentimental streak. "What's gotten into you today? Did you watch some cheesy rom-com last night? Or have another existential crisis over your overpriced kale smoothie?" Rachel teased. "I don't know," Angela sighed. "I just woke up today realizing how hollow all of this, our lives, our routines, really is. People can chase wealth and status forever, but without real emotions, without love and understanding, none of it feels meaningful." Rachel rolled her eyes but remained silent for a moment, tapping her coffee cup with her perfectly manicured nails. "You're such a hopeless romantic," she finally said. "But maybe you've got a point. Even the Millers can't buy happiness, can they?" Rachel rolled her eyes. "Did you take some psychedelic mushrooms or start experimenting with new supplements?" "You really know how to be supportive," Angela snapped, storming off without a backward glance, leaving Rachel stunned and alone. High society often buzzed with gossip about the Millers, confident in their own flawless reputations. Meanwhile, the Miller children, raised under a regime of strict discipline and relentless expectations, had grown up and started pursuing their own lives. Andrew, the eldest, had gone abroad for college, while Alyssa, their youngest, enrolled in a prestigious design school. Immersed in her artistic endeavours, Alyssa rarely gave much thought to her family's affairs. After finishing his studies, Andrew returned home to reconnect with his family and figure out the next steps in his life. One evening, he decided to introduce his girlfriend to his parents. Gathering his courage, Andrew walked into the living room where Edward and Susan were sitting at a beautifully arranged table, sipping tea. Susan's sharp instincts immediately sensed something unusual. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone tinged with suspicion. "You look serious." Taking a deep breath, Andrew blurted out, "I've met someone. Her name is Maria, and we love each other. I want you to meet her. She's going to be my fiancée." From behind, Andrew stepped a timid young woman, shifting uncomfortably as if wishing she could disappear. Her nervousness filled the room. Susan nearly spilled her tea at the announcement, her sharp eyes immediately scrutinizing the guest. Maria's plain appearance and demeanor seemed out of place in the Millers' sophisticated world, but something about her seemed familiar. Then it hit Susan. This was the daughter of Vera Barnes, a former co-worker from the daycare where Susan had worked years ago. Maria had been one of the kids in her group, often left behind long after the other children had gone home, because her mother, too busy caring for other people's children, had little time for her own. The memory stirred a mix of emotions in Susan: resentment, disbelief, and an unsettling sense of irony. "How could my son choose someone like her?" she thought. "We invested so much in his education and future, and this is what he brings home. A commoner?" "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you," Susan said, her voice calm but with an edge that only Andrew could detect. "So, Maria, do you study or work?" Maria smiled shyly. "I'm a primary school teacher. I love working with children." Her words brought a wave of conflicted feelings over Susan. On the one hand, she respected the teaching profession, having worked in early childhood education herself. On the other hand, this wasn't what she had envisioned for her son. She had imagined him with someone polished, ambitious, someone who could become a part of the Miller business empire. Edward also watched Maria closely during dinner, his displeasure barely concealed despite his polite facade. He had always envisioned his son marrying someone from a wealthy, influential family to bolster their social standing and secure their legacy. Later that evening, after Maria and Andrew had left, Edward and Susan sat in the living room, discussing the situation in hushed yet urgent tones. They brainstormed ways to persuade Andrew to reconsider his choice, but he remained resolute. He loved Maria and refused to give her up for anyone's ambitions. "You're kidding, right? A simple primary school teacher? She doesn't understand our world," Edward said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Dad, does it matter what she does? What matters is that she's a good person and we're happy together," Andrew replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "Happiness isn't a serious foundation for a life," Susan snapped, standing abruptly. "You need to think about the future of this family, our legacy, not some fleeting romantic notions." Edward raised a hand in an attempt to mediate. "All right, let's take a step back. Susan, let's hear him out." But Susan wasn't ready to yield. "No, Edward, this is ridiculous. I will not let my son tie his life to someone so ordinary. We'll find you a suitable match, someone from a good family with resources and connections. Then we can talk about happiness." Andrew stood silently, his frustration boiling over. He wanted to yell, to convince them that love was more valuable than wealth or status, but he knew it would be futile. Catching his father's uneasy glance and his mother's cold determination, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. That night, he lay awake, torn between his love for Maria and his family's relentless expectations. His heart urged him to follow his love, but his mind warned of the inevitable clash. The next morning, Susan, having calmed down, approached Andrew with a calculated gentleness. She knew another argument would only push him further away. "Andrew, we know you care about Maria, but we're worried about your future," she began softly. "Worried? About what?" Andrew asked, his brow furrowed. "Well," Edward interjected, "her family isn't exactly on the same footing as ours." Andrew rolled his eyes. "I know that. So what? What matters is who she is, not how much money her family has. Besides, we have more than enough to make up for anything they lack." "That's not the point," Susan said firmly. "You know your father and I have certain expectations for your future wife." "Expectations?" Andrew repeated incredulously. "Are you serious? Is everything about money and connections to you? Do love and emotions mean nothing?" "You can't live on love alone," Edward said bluntly. "The honeymoon phase lasts 6 months, maybe a year. After that, you need someone who can help shoulder real responsibilities. You're going to inherit the family business one day, and we want someone by your side who can handle that life." "We only want what's best for you," Susan added, her tone softening. "Please, just think about it." Andrew shook his head, exhaling sharply. "I hear you, but you're underestimating her. Maria's smart, kind and hard-working. I know she can handle any challenge." Edward and Susan exchanged a look, recognizing the determination in their son's voice. But deep down, neither was ready to accept his choice. The room was heavy with unspoken tension, signaling the beginning of a larger battle between family expectations and Andrew's pursuit of his own happiness. After meeting Maria several months passed, Susan continued to hold on to the hope that Andrew's relationship was just a fleeting infatuation, and that he would eventually find a more suitable partner. But as time went on, the young couple's bond only grew stronger. One evening, following yet another tense family dinner, Susan decided it was time for an honest conversation with her son. "Andrew," she began, her tone measured but insistent, "I know you're an adult and capable of making your own decisions, but think about this. Can Maria really be your equal? You have incredible prospects ahead of you. You need a woman who can be your support, your partner. A wife should be the crown jewel of your life, not a patch on a designer suit." Andrew stared at his mother, his disbelief clear. "Mom, what are you even saying? I love Maria. She makes me happy. Isn't that what matters most?" Susan sighed heavily. She realized that arguments about status and wealth might not sway her son, but deep down she still clung to the belief that she could make him see reason. "No one has ever resisted my persuasion before," she reassured herself. She remained convinced she could change his mind in time. But Andrew stood his ground. Frustrated by the constant pressure, he finally issued an ultimatum. "Mum, stop this now. If you keep bad-mouthing Maria, we'll leave. We'll move far away and I won't even tell you where. If you can't respect my choices, I'll cut off all communication," he warned. Reluctantly, Susan and Edward decided to relent, at least outwardly. They agreed to move forward with the wedding, but they adamantly refused to meet Maria's parents or include them in the grand plans. The wedding was set to take place at the city's most luxurious venue, a restaurant typically reserved for the most prominent social events. Susan and Edward spared no expense to ensure the day was as elegant and impressive as possible. The guest list included business magnates, politicians, and a sprinkling of celebrities. Everything had to be flawless. But one issue loomed large over their plans. Susan and Edward couldn't bear the thought of inviting Maria's humble parents. "Edward, I can't do it," Susan said, exasperated as she paced the living room. "The thought of those commoners mingling with our guests makes my skin crawl. What if someone asks them a question and they say something embarrassing? Can you imagine the humiliation?" Edward frowned but nodded in agreement. "It's not ideal. We have to handle this delicately." To avoid the potential embarrassment of Maria's parents attending the lavish celebration, Susan and Edward devised a plan. They sent an invitation to Maria's parents, Vera and Michael, But the address on the invitation was for a completely different venue, a simpler, though still respectable restaurant on the outskirts of the city. They'll think they're at the right place, and by the time they figure out the mistake, the wedding will nearly be over, Susan reasoned as she discussed the plan with Edward. The other guests will be too tipsy to notice anything, and Maria's parents won't want to ruin their daughter's special day by making a scene. Meanwhile, preparations for the wedding were in full swing. Susan personally oversaw every detail, from the table settings and floral arrangements to the exact placement of name cards. Each element was meticulously planned because this event was meant to symbolize the beginning of a new, elevated chapter in their son's life. Edward, on the other hand, focused on curating the guest list, ensuring a strategic mix of influential figures. Andrew Carter must be seated next to Detective Lewis, he told the event planners, carefully adjusting the seating chart. Why? Susan asked, raising an eyebrow. Isn't it obvious? Edward replied, genuinely surprised at her question. The district attorney and the chief of police always have things to discuss. This isn't just a party, it's an opportunity. Of course, Susan said, smacking her forehead as the realization dawned. Finally, the big day arrived. The venue, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, sparkled with opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and the walls were adorned with original artwork. The hall was filled with floral garlands, and tables were arranged with elegant china and silverware, laden with gourmet dishes. A live string quartet played soft melodic music, setting a festive but sophisticated tone. Waitstaff in impeccable uniforms greeted guests with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Every detail exuded luxury and refinement. Susan, dressed in a designer gown of shimmering silk, stood beside Edward, who was equally polished in a custom-tailored suit. Together, they welcomed their guests with polite smiles, though Susan's eyes occasionally betrayed her unease. Despite the perfection of the preparations, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something might go wrong. Andrew and Maria were the first to arrive, radiant with happiness. Their faces glowed with excitement as they walked into the hall. Edward and Susan did their best to appear pleased, greeting them warmly, though internally their emotions churned. The guilt of deceiving Maria's parents lingered, but they justified their actions as necessary. It's just one day, Susan thought. We're footing the bill for everything, and it's for the best. As the evening unfolded, the Millers remained at the center of the celebration, mingling with guests, posing for photos, and exchanging pleasantries. The event was everything they had envisioned, lavish, sophisticated, and unforgettable. Yet, beneath the surface, the weight of their decisions hung heavy. They couldn't ignore the gnawing thought that their deception might cast a long shadow over their son's marriage and their relationship with his new family. Susan glanced at Edward, who seemed equally preoccupied, and for the first time she wondered if they had gone too far. Andrew and Maria couldn't have cared less about the grandeur of their wedding. In fact, they would have been perfectly content with a simple celebration surrounded by close friends, if not for Andrew's parents' insistence. Do whatever you think is necessary, Andrew had said dismissively, giving his parents free rein. Susan and Edward eagerly took charge, determined to host a wedding that would uphold the Miller family's prestigious reputation. Susan threw herself into the preparations with her usual fervour, calling the city's most sought-after florists, decorators, and chefs to craft a celebration worthy of royalty. Edward, while less emotionally invested, managed the budget and coordinated with VIP guests. The venue they chose was the city's most exclusive restaurant, a place reserved for billionaires' galas and politicians' milestone events. Its grand banquet halls sparkled with crystal chandeliers and mirrored walls, creating an atmosphere of unparalleled luxury. The menu was designed in collaboration with a renowned chef, celebrated for his sophisticated cuisine and elegant desserts. Susan even handpicked outfits for every family member, including Maria. Despite her lack of interest in such extravagance, Maria reluctantly agreed to wear a designer gown, understanding how important appearances were to Andrew's parents. "Thank you," Maria said sincerely to her future mother-in-law. "I really appreciate everything you've done." Susan, however, brushed off Maria's gratitude. She wasn't doing this for Maria. She was doing it for herself and her family's reputation. Everything had to be flawless in the eyes of the city's elite. The big day finally arrived, and guests began streaming into the venue long before the ceremony. They were greeted by a dazzling display of floral arrangements, glittering lights, and meticulous attention to detail. Photographers roamed the hall, capturing every moment to ensure the event's grandeur was immortalized. Even the skeptics who had initially dismissed the wedding as over the top couldn't help but admire the opulence. "What a spectacle!" murmured guests as they marveled at the scene. But as the celebration unfolded, one detail became glaringly obvious. Maria's parents were nowhere to be seen. Maria, understandably, grew uneasy. "Andrew, I feel like something's wrong," she said, glancing around anxiously. "Don't worry. They're probably just stuck in traffic," Andrew replied, though doubt flickered in his voice. "No, Andrew," Maria insisted, her tone sharper now. "You don't know my mum. She's always punctual, especially on a day like today. Something's not right." Maria called her mother, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. After a few rings, Vera's voice answered, sounding hesitant. "Mum, where are you? Everyone's here except you." "We've been at the restaurant for hours," Vera replied, her voice tinged with confusion. "We even came early to make sure we weren't late, but no one is here. We've looked through all the halls and the tables aren't even set. It's so strange." Maria's stomach dropped. "Mum," she asked carefully, her voice trembling, "what's the name of the restaurant?" "Let me check the invitation," Vera replied. A moment later she read aloud, "It says Integral." Maria's heart sank. "Mum, are you sure? Are you positive that's what the invitation says?" "Of course, Maria. Your father and I even showed it to the taxi driver to make sure we got here. Why? Is something wrong?" Vera asked, sounding increasingly concerned. "Mum, that restaurant is on the other side of the city," Maria exclaimed, her voice breaking. "There's been some sort of mistake. Take a taxi and come to the Astoria restaurant as quickly as you can." Hanging up, Maria turned to Andrew, her eyes brimming with tears. "Your parents sent my parents an invitation with the wrong address. They deliberately told them to go to a restaurant across town so they'd miss the wedding." Andrew froze, staring at Maria's trembling hands gripping her phone. His face turned red with fury as he processed what she was saying. Memories of countless arguments with his parents flooded his mind. How he had tried to convince them of Maria's worth, only to face their constant interference. "How could they?" he said through gritted teeth, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is our day. How dare they pull something like this? I'm not letting them get away with it." Maria, seeing the fire in his eyes, gently placed a calming hand on his arm. "Andrew, please, don't let this ruin our day. Let's focus on what to do next." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his emotions. "You're right. We won't stoop to their level. But this can't go unanswered. They need to know they've crossed a line." "And they will," Maria replied, her voice resolute as a determined glint flashed in her eyes. "I've already got an idea." "What are you planning?" Andrew asked, raising an eyebrow. "Remember how I told you about my side gig as an entertainer?" Maria asked, still sniffling but pulling herself together. "You mean your work as an event host?" "Exactly. I know a team of performers who can pull off just about anything. Let me make a call. Trust me. We'll fix this." Andrew watched as Maria dialed one of her contacts. Her voice shifted from trembling to firm and persuasive as she explained the situation, laying out her plan with precision. He couldn't help but smile, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "She could talk a corpse out of its grave," Andrew muttered to himself, equal parts resigned and impressed. Whatever Maria had planned, Andrew was certain of one thing. She wouldn't let the day end without ensuring her parents' presence and sending a powerful message to his own. This was, without a doubt, the most cunning plan Andrew and Maria could devise to exact a bit of revenge on his parents. While Maria touched up her makeup in the ladies' room, Andrew stepped out to address the guests and buy some time. "Dear friends and family," he began, his voice warm and composed, "we're so grateful to have you here to celebrate this special day with us. Unfortunately, there's been a slight delay. My lovely bride is feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the excitement and needs a moment to collect herself. In the meantime, please enjoy the delicious food and refreshments. The tables are set for your enjoyment." The guests, who had grown increasingly restless, murmured their approval and eagerly turned their attention to the lavish spread of food and drinks. Shortly afterward, a convoy of sleek, luxurious limousines pulled up to the venue, immediately drawing the crowd's attention. As the cars parked, the doors swung open, and out stepped individuals who bore uncanny resemblances to famous actors and celebrities, including a man who looked astonishingly like Tom Hanks. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. "Ali, am I losing my mind, or is that Tom Hanks?" one guest asked her friend, her eyes wide. "Pinch me! I need to know I'm not hallucinating," Ali squealed. "Calm down," her friend replied, rolling her eyes. "You're going to spill your champagne all over me." The guests, thoroughly intrigued and starstruck, craned their necks to get a better view of the arrivals. Only a few, those privy to the plan, struggled to suppress their laughter. They knew these celebrities were, in fact, professional impersonators from Maria's entertainer team. The effect was dazzling. Susan and Edward watched the spectacle with a mix of confusion and growing unease. "Edward, are you seeing this?" Susan whispered, trying to maintain her composure as her fingers fidgeted with her designer clutch. Meanwhile, the faux Tom Hanks strode confidently toward the newlyweds, his mannerisms so spot on that it was almost eerie. Taking the microphone, he delivered a heartfelt and seemingly spontaneous speech. "Dear Maria and Andrew, congratulations on this monumental day. Marriage is a sacred bond, one that requires patience, love, and understanding. Life doesn't come with a rewind button, so treasure every moment and hold each other close." The audience erupted into applause, captivated by the performance. It felt like they were extras in a glamorous Hollywood film. Unable to endure the confusion any longer, Susan sidled up to her son, her voice low and urgent. "Andrew, what is going on? Who are these people?" Andrew turned to her with a sly smile. "Mom, patience is a virtue. You'll find out soon enough." By then, Maria had returned, her composure fully restored. With a radiant smile, she addressed the crowd, introducing the actor with a flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to introduce my beloved godfather, Tom, who is also a distant cousin of my dear mother-in-law and a cherished family friend." The room buzzed with excitement as guests whispered among themselves, fully swept up in the grandeur of the moment. Susan and Edward exchanged uneasy glances, their carefully curated event spinning into something entirely out of their control. Susan and Edward's jaws dropped. Unsure how to respond, they scrambled to address the supposed celebrity standing before them. "Oh, Tom, forgive us for not recognizing you right away," Susan stammered, her voice laced with forced cheer. "Why didn't you let us know you'd be coming? We would have prepared a special seat for you near the bride and groom." The impostor, flawlessly embodying the air of arrogance, scoffed dramatically. "You were planning to seat me in this barn," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Darling, when entertaining stars, one must anticipate greatness, not scramble around like amateurs. Honestly, this feels more like a roadside diner than an exclusive soirée." The room froze as the faux Tom continued his critique, gesturing dramatically at the surroundings. "Did you even look at this table? The centerpiece, dreadful. The flowers, atrocious. And the food. I wouldn't even serve it to my French bulldog, Polly. She has impeccable taste, you know, starred in Galaxy Trek and After the Sunset. Absolute diva, but aren't all great actresses. Feigning enthusiasm, Susan forced a smile, her nails digging into her palm. Oh, how wonderful, she said, though she despised animals and often claimed a fake allergy to avoid them. The imposter wasn't done. Yes, Polly's a gem. And just recently we added a Scottish fold cat to our family. Holly, she comes from an incredibly distinguished lineage. You should meet her sometime. She has a better pedigree than most people I know. As Susan tried to maintain her composure, her smile wavering, the actor scanned the room critically before raising his voice for everyone to hear. But tell me, where are my dear cousin Vera and her husband? I don't see them anywhere. Surely you didn't forget to invite them, did you? The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Susan and Edward. The couple exchanged frantic glances, panic written across their faces. Finally, Susan, summoning her courage, replied in an overly bright tone, "Unfortunately, they couldn't make it. There were unforeseen circumstances." The actor arched an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Unforeseen circumstances, you say? How tragic. I do hope your dessert is more thoughtfully prepared than your guest list. I do love a good cake." The tension in the room was thick as the guests whispered among themselves, the imposter's biting remarks cutting through the carefully curated facade. Susan and Edward squirmed, their perfect event spiraling into chaos as their elaborate deception began to unravel in the most spectacular fashion. The air grew heavy with tension as the scene took a dramatic turn. Andrew, standing resolutely at the centre of the room, stepped forward and addressed the guests with a steady, clear voice. "Dear friends," he began, his tone both firm and sorrowful, "I feel it's my responsibility to reveal the truth. Since my parents lack the courage to admit what they've done, I'll say it plainly. My mother and father are, unfortunately, true snobs. They look down on ordinary people, calling them names like commoners and worse. It bothered them so much that my bride comes from a humble working-class family that they deliberately sent her parents an invitation with the wrong address. That's why they're not here with us tonight." The room fell into a stunned silence before erupting in murmurs of shock and disapproval. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers rippling through the air. "Is your love for appearances greater than your love for family?" one guest muttered. "Even the simplest soul knows how to treat others with dignity." The faux Tom Hanks, still in character, seized the moment to deliver a cutting rebuke. "What a disgrace," he said, gesturing dramatically at Susan and Edward. "Even a dog shows more loyalty to its pack than you've shown to your own kin. Such arrogance is repugnant. Frankly, I'm appalled." Susan and Edward stood rooted to the spot, their faces flushed with humiliation. The guests' judgmental stares bore down on them, and for the first time in their carefully curated lives, they were utterly exposed. The actor, clearly relishing his role, theatrically fanned himself. "I can't stand it in here," he declared. "The stench of superiority is suffocating. I know a better place. Let's all go." With that, the Hanks entourage swept toward the limousines parked outside, making a grand show of their departure. Many of the younger guests eagerly followed, leaving Susan and Edward standing awkwardly in the nearly empty hall, their grand celebration reduced to a hollow spectacle. The relocated party was a resounding success. Maria's animator friends had prepared a cozy club across town, transforming it into a warm and lively space filled with string lights, colourful decorations, and an infectious sense of joy. There, Maria's parents, Vera and Michael, finally joined the celebration. The atmosphere was electric, with laughter, music, and games bringing everyone closer together. Far from the rigid opulence of the original venue, this intimate gathering was a true celebration of love and unity. Andrew and Maria danced together, surrounded by friends and family who shared in their happiness. It was a night to remember, not for its extravagance, but for its sincerity and heart. Meanwhile, Susan and Edward remained behind in the grand but eerily quiet restaurant, their humiliation hanging heavily in the air. "How could this happen?" Susan hissed at Edward, her face flushed with anger. "You were supposed to double-check everything." "Oh, so now it's my fault?" Edward shot back, his voice sharp. "You're the one who insisted on sending them to the wrong address. You were so obsessed with keeping up appearances." "Don't you dare blame me," Susan retorted, her hands on her hips, her eyes blazing. Edward sighed deeply, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Listen, Susan, we made a mistake. We overplayed our hand. We thought we could control everything, but life doesn't work that way." "And whose fault is that?" Susan snapped, refusing to let it go. Defeated, Edward sank onto a nearby sofa and buried his face in his hands. "Maybe we should have trusted Andrew's instincts from the beginning. Maybe we should have just let him be happy instead of trying to control everything," he muttered. Susan stood in silence, her chest heaving as she struggled with the weight of his words. Deep down, she knew he was right, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it, not even to herself. While the younger crowd danced and celebrated well into the night, Andrew and Maria found a quiet moment to approach Maria's parents. "Mum, Dad, I'm so sorry for what happened today," Maria said, her voice trembling with emotion. Vera wrapped her daughter in a warm embrace. "What matters is that you love each other and are happy," she said gently. "Everything else is just noise." Michael nodded, his expression kind but firm. If Andrew's parents realized their mistakes, that would be wonderful. But if not, don't worry about it. We're not holding a grudge. You can't force people to change. That's something they'll have to figure out on their own. For Susan and Edward, however, the aftermath of the wedding marked a turning point in their lives. The tension between them deepened into a rift as blame and resentment bubbled beneath the surface. Edward began spending more and more time at work, burying himself in business matters, while Susan retreated to their luxurious country home, isolating herself from the judgment and whispers of high society. "Why, God? Why would you let this happen to me?" Susan lamented during her lonely evenings. "Couldn't you have sent me a sign to avoid this disgrace?" In time, the truth of the Millers' actions spread throughout their social circles. Those who had attended the wedding whispered about the fiasco, and some even distanced themselves entirely from the family. Despite Susan and Edward's attempts to repair their tarnished image, the damage was irreparable. Their true nature, once cloaked by their wealth and status, was now an open secret, leaving them to confront the consequences of their pride and decisions alone. After the infamous Miller wedding, the scandal became the talk of the town. Irina, predictably, couldn't resist dissecting the event with her closest friend, Angela. "Who would have thought the Millers were such snobs?" Irina said, shaking her head dramatically. "Exactly," Angela replied, savouring the gossip. "I mean, I don't associate with just anyone either, but this is a whole new level." "Absolutely," Irina agreed with a knowing smirk. Former friends and acquaintances of the Millers began avoiding them, unwilling to risk their own reputations by being associated with the fallout. Even distant relatives quietly cut ties, not wanting to be linked to such a scandal. Meanwhile, Andrew and Maria embraced a fresh start. Shortly after Andrew graduated from Harvard, he accepted a prestigious job offer from a global company in the United States. Their departure came with little fanfare, especially since Andrew had chosen not to inform his parents directly. Susan learned of her son's move secondhand, overhearing it through a mutual acquaintance. Pacing anxiously in her lavish living room, phone in hand, she tried calling Andrew multiple times, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. Her emotions oscillated between anger and heartbreak. "I poured so much effort and money into that boy," she thought bitterly. "And now he's moved halfway across the world without so much as a word to me." As the hours passed, her resentment only grew. "How could he abandon me like this?" she muttered aloud, "especially now, when I need him most. Society has turned its back on us, and he's the only one who can help restore our name. Doesn't he understand that?" Sitting alone, Susan replayed the humiliating events of the wedding over and over in her mind. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain a pristine image, yet the public disgrace of that day had shattered everything she worked so hard to build. "Why would he do this to me?" she whispered, staring blankly out the window. It must have been her, Maria. She planted these ridiculous ideas in his head. He would never have done this on his own. Her bitterness spiraled as she imagined the whispers, the mocking glances from people passing by. Even her once beloved walks through the city now felt unbearable. It seemed as though every stranger on the street knew her shame and was silently laughing at her downfall. "Maybe I should leave," she thought briefly, but the idea of giving up her comfortable life filled her with dread. Where would I go? What would I do? Grasping for a sense of control, Susan tried calling Andrew once more, only to hear his voicemail again. Frustrated, she flung the phone onto the couch and collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Meanwhile, Andrew was settling into his new life in the US, diving headfirst into challenging projects at his new job. The transition wasn't without its difficulties. Adjusting to a new culture and time zone made staying in touch with friends and family in Russia a challenge. But over time, he adapted to the rhythm of his new environment, and his work became a source of pride and fulfillment. Maria, though supportive of Andrew's career move, struggled more with the adjustment. "Andrew, I'm happy you got this great opportunity," she admitted one evening. "But it's been hard for me to adapt. Teaching here isn't an option unless I focus on Russian language, and I doubt there's much demand for that." "Have you thought about trying something new?" Andrew suggested gently. "You're young, Maria. This could be the perfect time to explore a different field or go back to school." His words stuck with her. Within weeks, Maria enrolled in an advanced English course to improve her communication skills. Inspired by the idea of a fresh start, she later decided to pursue her long-time passion for design, enrolling in a program to train in decorative arts. After earning her certifications, Maria secured a position at a small but innovative design agency. Eager to contribute, she quickly immersed herself in her new role. One afternoon, she approached her boss, Mr. Michelson, to discuss a project. "Mr. Michelson, I have a few questions about the project you assigned me yesterday," Maria began. "Of course, Maria," he replied with a warm smile. "I appreciate your initiative. Let's go over it." "I love the concept of using bold colors and unconventional shapes," Maria said, "but I'm concerned about how the logo fits into the overall design. It's intricate, and I worry it might lose its impact in this layout." "I'm glad you noticed that," Mr. Michelson said, nodding thoughtfully. "Logo integration is critical. We might need to resize it, or use contrasting backgrounds to make it stand out." "Do you think we should propose an alternative logo specifically tailored for this project?" Maria asked. "That's an excellent idea," he said. "Prepare a few variations and we'll review them before presenting them to the client." "Will do," Maria said, jotting down notes. "Also, what's the timeline for this project? I want to make sure I leave enough time for revisions." "You've got 2 weeks," Mr. Michelson replied. "Let's stick to that schedule so we can make any necessary adjustments. Remember, quality is the priority." "Got it," Maria said with a smile. "Thank you for clarifying. I'll get started right away." With renewed confidence, Maria dove into her first major assignment at the agency. Though her journey hadn't been easy, she was finally carving out her own path in this new chapter of life. Meanwhile, Andrew's career continued to flourish. Together they looked forward to their future, building a life far removed from the shadow of the Miller family scandal. Maria's creative potential blossomed in the fresh cultural landscape of her new home. She relished the opportunity to bring her ideas to life, drawing inspiration from the vibrant diversity around her. Over time, she and Andrew built a cozy home, made new friends, and began planning to grow their family. Life in America was exciting and fulfilling, yet they occasionally longed for the familiar sights, scents, and warmth of their hometown and the loved ones they had left behind. Still, the opportunities that America offered were undeniable. A year after their move, their family grew with the arrival of a baby boy, Michael. Meanwhile, back in Russia, Susan and Edward found themselves metaphorically at the broken trough. When Michael was born, they received only a single photograph. In contrast, Maria's parents, Vera and Michael, were invited to visit their grandson, their trip fully funded by Andrew. The proud grandparents spent weeks doting on the newborn, basking in the joy of their growing family. For Susan and Edward, the photograph of baby Michael became their only connection to their grandson. They looked at it often with a bittersweet mix of sadness and longing, knowing they were no longer part of Andrew's life. Each time Susan held the picture, she was transported back to the day Andrew had left for America without a word. At first, her anger had burned fiercely, fueled by disbelief that her son could abandon everything she believed she had done for him. But over time, her fury dulled into a heavy melancholy. Sitting by the window of her now quiet home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Susan often wondered how Andrew and Maria were doing so far away. The silence of her house had become almost unbearable. She missed the sound of Andrew's footsteps, his laughter, and the sight of him sitting at the kitchen table, sharing stories about his day. Her heart ached with a deep, relentless longing. Occasionally, Susan would summon the courage to call Andrew. Their conversations were polite but brief, updates about his work and Michael's latest milestones. The emotional distance between them was undeniable, and Susan knew she was the one who had created that chasm through her stubbornness and rejection of his choices. "I destroyed my own happiness with my own hands," she murmured one evening, her voice breaking as she stared out the window. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, and she rubbed her temples as if trying to dispel the storm of regret swirling in her mind. Outside, the autumn wind howled, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. "I wanted only the best for you, Andrew," she whispered to the empty room, "but I confused control with love. Instead of supporting you, I pushed you away with my demands and expectations." Her eyes fell on an old photograph on the table. It showed her, Andrew and Edward during happier times, laughing, carefree, their bond unbroken. A tear slid down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail. "How did we lose each other like this?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on the image. The wind outside grew fiercer, rattling the window panes, but Susan hardly noticed the cold seeping through the cracks. Her thoughts were consumed by the past and all the ways she could have acted differently. Rising from her chair, she moved to the window and closed her eyes, listening to the wind as if it carried a message. Perhaps it was her conscience reminding her that not all was lost, that there was still time to mend the broken pieces. Maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over.